Welcome back to season 3 of the How to Japanese podcast. Just a quick heads up at the top of the episode. I recorded my conversation with Matt Schley before the title of the new Murakami novel was announced. It doesn't really have much to do with what we talk about, but I thought I'd give that heads up here. Today I'm talking with Matt Schley. He's a writer based in Tokyo. He's contributed to the Japan Times and Screen International, and actually, we've been corresponding for, I think, 7 years now at this point about Murakami's mythical origin story.
Yes. Well, thanks for having me on, and thank you very much for all your help when I was kind of writing about this story back in the day.
How did you initially get interested in Murakami?
Well, when I was a teenager, I was into Japan via the typical stuff of somebody of my generation of anime and video games and movies and stuff. And I was really into Philip K. Dick at the time.
Okay.
And a friend of mine kind of said, "Hey, well, you like Japan and you like Philip K. Dick. There's this author you might dig called Murakami Haruki." And at the time, there were a few of his novels out in English. And this friend of mine pointed me toward Wild Sheep Chase.
Oh, nice.
And, the connection between like Philip K. Dick and Murakami isn't like immediately apparent, but I kind of see them as they're writing about these kind of lonely, alienated guys in the modern world with a little bit of fantasy or science fiction thrown in there. So I loved it. And I kind of sought out all his books. And then when I was learning Japanese, he was a great kind of first author to start reading Japanese fiction. Number one, because he writes in a very straightforward style. And then number two, I had already read them in English. So it was, even if I didn't understand everything that was going on, it was like I had a vague idea of what the story was to begin with.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, if Dick, I'm surprised he didn't point you towards Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World, because that one has got so much crazy science fiction going on.
Yeah, you know what? It's been so long. He might have, and maybe Wild Sheep Chase was what they had at my local library.
A good one to start with because of the length too. I do feel like that's a good first Murakami.
Absolutely. I mean, I still think that's my favorite of his. So.
It's one of my top Murakami novels too, for sure.
And it's the only one that's got that delightful illustration by Murakami.
Yes,
of a sheep.
This is part of how Matt and I initially connected. Unfortunately, some of these websites have been lost to the sands of time, and not even archive.org can help us. But I don't even know how I did it, but when Matt initially contacted me, we were trying to figure out who had done this drawing of it, and there had been some kind of exhibit somewhere, and somebody on Twitter or some other kind of short-lived blog had posted a reaction to their going to this exhibit with a photo of the sheepman and saying something along the lines that Murakami himself had drawn it. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah. And thank you again for helping me out on
that. And then, you kind of like gave me a nudge, I think, when I got back in the country last year, and I was like, oh yeah, let me look into that when I go to the National Diet Library, for sure, which is, if you haven't been there and you live in Japan, it's worth going alone for the cafe. It's a good cafe. So
it's a really wonderful place. And I hadn't been since the pandemic and stuff, but I went recently, and it was just as good as it always was.
How did you get interested in this topic in particular?
Well, I did I did an MA at Sophia here in Tokyo about that time, about 7 years ago. And it was an interesting confluence of two things that I really like, which is Murakami and the Yakult Swallows. I was doing my thesis on like fan culture and kind of an anthropological look at fans and why they become fans of a certain thing or whatever. And I was focusing specifically on Swallows fans, largely because I could call it research and just go watch baseball games. But as you know, and as a lot of listeners know, Murakami is also a huge Swallows fan.
Hmm.
And in fact, the origin story we're about to talk about has a lot to do with the Swallows. So I took a literature course where we talked about Murakami. And so it was just kind of, well, how can I kind of tie in my own research with Murakami? And the origin story was kind of the perfect confluence of those two things.
Nice. Yeah, and this is something that he's talked about over and over and over again over the last, um, at this point, 40 years. And we've taken 8 different accounts that we've been able to find. Some of them we literally just found last week. Not like these are hidden anywhere. Murakami makes them readily available, but I think some are easier to find than others. And so we're going to run through those real quick, and then I think talk about what it means, what Murakami's trying to do with this. But I think it's also interesting just to think about, if we believe this, we know the specific day when Murakami started writing, which is not something you know about a lot of different writers.
Yeah, that's very true. So, before we go through these individual accounts, do we just want to kind of break down
That's a great idea.
the story at most basic? Okay, so the Yakult Swallows are a um, baseball team based in Tokyo in the Central League. They've been around since 1950. Not always Yakult. They've had a couple different owners. Um, they're traditionally thought of as a very poor team, kind of an underdog team compared to the Yomiuri Giants, who are the huge kind of Yankees of Japan, also based in Tokyo. Um, Long story short, Murakami is from Kobe, as Murakami fans know, but he moved to Tokyo when he was 18, I believe, and he kind of had this philosophy. Well, you should root for the home team when you go to see a game. So he kind of converted from being a Hanshin Tigers fan to being a Yakult fan. He also had his jazz cafe really close to the Jingu Stadium, which is where the team is based. So on April 1st, 1978, Murakami, he's 29 years old. He's running his jazz cafe, and he goes to see the opening day game at Jingu. There is a foreign player named Dave Hilton who's making his debut with the Swallows. His first up to bat, he hits a double. And at that exact moment, according to Murakami, he thinks, wow, I can write a novel. It kind of just hits him like a bolt of lightning, or it hits him like, depending on the origin story, it hits him like different things, which we'll get into. But then he leaves the game. The Swallows win, by the way. Then he leaves the game. He goes to buy a fountain pen and some paper, goes back to his jazz cafe, and sits down at the table and starts writing.
Yep. Yeah, and then writes every night after work until 3, 4 in the morning, and finishes the book that fall right as the Swallows win the Japan series in their 29th year in the league.
Yes, their very first time to win the Japan series.
So yeah, the first time that we've been able to track down that he wrote about this was in it's a book because it's in a book, but it's actually an interview between him and Murakami Ryu called "Walk Don't Run." This is called a taidan in Japanese, which is literally, I like to compare it to a podcast. Actually, it's like the original podcast. It's not an interview per se. It's just two people talking with each other, and they publish them in Japanese literary magazines. And so somebody had the great idea with these two Murakamis, both kind of coming up in the literary scene, to get them together and have two different conversations, one on July 29th, 1980, and the other on July 20th, 1981, so a year apart. I'm pretty sure that they were published separately in different publications, likely in Shosetsu Gendai, but the book form collects both of them, and that's where I read it. And so there's, as they kind of get going and are having the conversation, they start about how they start writing. They're talking about the student movement. Murakami mentions that everyone's agitated. It's the end of the era. He has a feeling that words have no meaning. And then he says, I really did want to write something when I was in my 20s, just scripts for movies, but I felt that a bunch of words, they've got no meaning. And so I couldn't write anything for 10 years. 10 years passed. I thought, all right, I should be able to write something, and I wrote it. I hardly wrote anything at all until I was 29, and this might be an exaggeration, but I felt like the reason I was able to write it was something like God's grace. I feel like it would be a terrible to waste that. I felt like I seriously couldn't do anything. And then I turned 29, and all of a sudden, it was right when I was watching a Yakult Swallows game at Jingu Stadium. It was opening day of this season. They won the championship. And Hilton hit a double to left center, his first at-bat. Yasuda threw a complete game, giving up one home run to Garrett. I saw that and I thought, okay, I don't know why, but I thought I'd write a novel. And then he laughs. I went straight to Shinjuku, bought a 5,000 yen fountain pen at Kinokuniya, and when I started writing, I was able to write.
Yeah, and the other Murakami Ryu asks, that was Hear the Wind Sing, and yeah, I don't think we've mentioned that yet, but yes, this is his debut novel, Hear the Wind Sing.
Yes. So, details. Opening day at Jingu. Hilton, double to left center. Yasuda throws a complete game. Gives up one home run. 5,000 yen fountain pen at Kinokuniya. And he finishes writing as the Swallows win the championship. And let's see. Actually, he also mentions that he brought the manuscript to the post office right in front of Jingu Stadium and submitted it for the Gunzo Prize. So kind of like sealing that good luck. And then that one word that we should point out, God's grace, that in Japanese is kami no on. What was it? Oncho? Onryu.
Yeah.
So that's a word that we'll see whether it comes up again in other instances, but feels pretty unique to Murakami here. In terms of unique in that not a word he's using all the time.
It's not a word he's using all the time. And it's definitely not a word that we are using all the time in Japanese.
Yeah.
When you look it up, you see a lot of associations with Christianity specifically. And it's an interesting, we'll get into this as we go through these a little bit, but the way that he phrases this in other instances kind of changes over time. So yeah, it's interesting word choice.
So the next account is from 1980, October 5th, 1980, in Number, which is a sports magazine. And Murakami collected it in a collection called Murakami Haruki Zatsubunshu, which is literally Murakami Haruki Miscellany. And it collects a lot of random magazine articles, newspaper articles, and also other Taidan conversations. And Murakami gives a short introduction to this article, and he says, for the longest time, I remember the Hiroshima opening day pitcher being Soto Koba, but it was actually Takahashi Satoshi. There were a few minor factual errors. We didn't have anything like Wikipedia at the time, but I've left them as is to preserve the flow of the writing. So we know already that first account where he said it was Yasuda was actually that's the other picture though. So this is okay.
Yeah, yes it is the Swallows picture.
So, okay. So no okay, so we're still okay so far. But he's admitting here that he's finding errors in his writing, which is interesting. And he wrote in 2011 when he's collecting this for publication. And so then in the actual article here he says there were no seats in the outfield section, just a grassy slope that the grass had half worn off of. When it rained, it got muddy, and on windy days, it blew sand into your ears. When they called play ball at 1 p.m. on opening day, I was lying on the outfield lawn drinking my second sip of beer. Hiroshima's starting pitcher was Takahashi Satoshi, so he's corrected that error. And then he stepped up to hit first, he being Dave Hilton. It was a beautiful hit. It landed in the exact middle of left field, and by the time Garrett and Yamamoto Koji caught up to it, he was standing on second base. I think that was the first hit in the league in 1978. So this article is, I should have mentioned, is a tribute to Dave Hilton, titled Dave Hilton no season, so Dave Hilton's season. And it goes on to mention most of the article is talking about Dave Hilton and the impression that he made as a player, and then how Murakami ran into him later that season at a supermarket in Hiro in Tokyo. But what else do you notice about this one?
Well, the biggest thing for me, and the reason this is interesting to me, will be revealed. Should we reveal it now? I don't
Yeah.
know. But anyway, he mentions the outfield section, which is just a grassy slope, according to him. Um, this is a great description of it too. The grass was half worn off, and it got muddy, and on windy days it blew sand into your ears, which sounds awful. But this is all great description. The thing about it is it's not true at all. When I was looking into this origin story, because I had some background also in the history of Jingu Stadium and the history of the Swallows, I kind of went, wait a sec, and I kind of flipped back through my Swallows memorabilia books and stuff like that, and realized in exactly this season, 1978, the outfield had been, up until that point, as Murakami describes it, just kind of a grassy slope. But before the season, Jingu was renovated so that the outfield seats became bleachers, kind of sit-down kind of benches. So, yeah, it's not true.
Yeah. I think that maybe that's one of those mistakes he left in for the flow of the article.
That might be the case, but he does repeat this exact same thing for years and years and years.
So by at least 2011, he's realized that maybe, I don't know, maybe he hasn't realized it about the seats. So, but he's realized it about some of the pitchers. And what else? He doesn't mention being inspired to write, I think because it's probably a focus on Dave Hilton. But he does mention this feeling a kind of premonition when he sees Dave Hilton at the plate. I don't think I read this section, but he mentions that when Dave Hilton steps up, he sees a flash of his spirit or something, and he uses God here too. It's the phrase is "Kami ni aisareru mono no itoki no kagayaki," so a slight flash of someone loved by God. Literally, that's a kind of literal bad English translation. But it's interesting to see God here in another article. Within a year or two of when it happened, and also within a year of the previous one that we just read.
I also like that this gives us more of a feel that his kind of love for Dave Hilton kind of wasn't that one instant, but it kind of went on through the season. Dave Hilton played, again, that was his first year for the Swallows. He played one more year for them in 79. And then he went back to the States for a year, and then he ended up playing a year for the Hanshin Tigers, which are based where Murakami is originally from, in Kansai. And that was the end of his career in Japan.
The next account we have, or that I've found, is from supplementary text to the Murakami Haruki Complete Works, which is published in 1991. So at this point, Murakami's been writing for a little over 10 years. He's become a major literary phenomenon after 1987 with Norwegian Wood. And so he publishes basically the first 10 years of his writing in a kind of selected complete work. So it's not like everything he wrote, but it's a selected version of that. And with each volume, he includes a small pamphlet of kind of supplementary text, explanatory text. And of course, for the Hear the Wind volume, that includes a little bit on his origin story. So he says, the reason I started to write this novel is actually pretty easy to explain. All of a sudden I wanted to write something. That's it. Honestly, I wanted to write on a whim. And so I went to the Kinokuniya in Shinjuku and bought a fountain pen and paper. Then I sat down at my desk. All of my time had gone into my work ever since I graduated from university, so other than taxes and the occasional letter, I had barely written even a single word. I'm not saying that to sound cool, it's actually true. And then he has a section again about how he tried writing scripts and that it wasn't any good. He says, not that it was ever serious enough to make me lay down the pen forever. I just thought if that's the way things are, that's okay, and gave up. And he goes on with his life. But one early afternoon when I was 29, I was laying out in the grassy outfield embankment section of Jingu Stadium. They still didn't have seats back then. And I thought, whether or not I have talent or ability, I just want to write something for myself. There wasn't any of the eagerness that I felt whenever I wanted to write something long ago. I was relieved even just to set the cheap pen and pad I'd just bought on my desk. 1978 was the year the Yakult Swallows won the championship. I started writing in the spring and finished right around the time they finally won. I was living nearby Jingu Stadium, so I went to see a lot of games. Yakult won its first championship in its 29th year in the league, and I too was 29. Of course, Matsuoka and Wakamatsu were great, but that season guys like Funada, Issei, and Hilton, guys past their prime, maybe you could call them athletes who weren't quite all-stars in the first place, were solid role players. I remember sitting at my desk and thinking, everyone's trying hard, I've got to try hard too. Every day I worked late, and then all through the night I'd drink beer and write at the kitchen table. Every day I wrote a little more, cutting off enough to make me think, that's enough for today. I think that's the reason the chapters are so fragmentary. So, again, no seats.
Again, no seats. Yeah, so a few things kind of strike me with this account. One, just the fact that 1991 you're releasing your complete works is so funny considering he's got another 30 years of work after this. That's and then the other thing that I find funny about it in that same vein is that he's kind of thinking of the age at 29 as kind of a like, oh, these burnt out guys. And I guess that might be true for sports. Maybe if you're 29, you're not a spring chicken anymore.
Yeah.
But he's also saying, oh God, I'm 29. I got to get going, which makes me feel pretty old.
Yeah, I guess he would be just over 40 when he wrote this. So, but his conception of age is I could probably do a whole podcast about that. Like his conception of how he chooses his protagonists' ages is always very interesting, and how he describes his ages is fun. But yeah, no, totally. I think maybe that feeling that pressure is maybe what got him to write. But he also calls it a cheap pen and pad here when we have from the previous the very first one, it was a 5,000 yen fountain pen, right?
Right. I mean, a 5,000 yen pen would be a luxury today, not let alone in 1978.
Yeah, the exchange rate back then would have been a little bit different. I think it was probably 200 or so yen to the dollar at that point. So,
okay, so we're saying that would be like what, $25 or so?
Yeah, still an expensive pen, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, here a cheap pad of paper. But still writing all night, so it's like pretty much the typical origin story. I think it'll be interesting to see. I don't think he writes in the very early years about not being able to write, right? Like I think moving forward, it'll be interesting to see. I think that falls off a little bit. The next account is from November 17th, 1992. It's quoted in Jay Rubin's book, Haruki Murakami and the Music of Words. It's a lecture he gave at Berkeley. So this is, a year after, so maybe, 2 years after he wrote the supplementary text, assuming that it was probably written before the publication process. And at this point, he's giving a lecture at Berkeley. At this point, he had been translated a little bit. I can't remember the exact dates, but he had at least had Wild Sheep Chase and probably Hardboiled Wonderland translated. But he wasn't a major name, I don't think, yet in the U.S. And so here's what he says then. But then suddenly one day in April 1978, I felt like writing a novel. I remember that day clearly. I was at a baseball game that afternoon in the outfield stands drinking beer. The stadium was a 10-minute walk from my apartment. My favorite team was the Yakult Swallows. They were playing the Hiroshima Carp. The Swallows' first batter in the bottom of the first inning was an American, Dave Hilton. You've probably never heard of him. He made a name for himself in the States, so he came to play ball in Japan. Oh, he never made a name for himself in the States, so he came to play ball in Japan. Excuse me. I'm pretty sure he was the leading hitter that year. Anyhow, he sent the first ball pitched to him that day into left field for a double. And that's when the idea struck me. I could write a novel. It was like a revelation, something out of the blue. There was no reason for it, no way to explain it. It was just an idea that came to me, just a thought. I could do it. The time had come for me to do it. When the game was over, and by the way, the Swallows won the game, I went to a stationery store and bought a fountain pen and paper.
Yeah, so do we know if he did this lecture in English or if he had a interpreter with
That's
him?
a good question. I don't know. I feel like I don't know. That's a really good question. I think this is
Yeah.
probably when he was living at Princeton. Maybe that might have overlapped with that
Mm,
time because,
mm.
or I know he was also at Tufts for I can't remember the exact years, but um, no, that's a good question. Was there any words that made you wonder?
Well, it says outfield
Yeah,
stands here, which is I
yeah,
mean, that's suitably kind of ambiguous.
yeah,
It could be seats, or it could be that slope.
yeah,
No, I was just curious. I mean, I know he's a very accomplished uh, reader, writer, translator of English, so um, just curious.
yeah. It could be the Gaya Seki, right? Like which is general enough to
Right.
mean seats or the slope, but that's
Exactly.
fallen off a little bit. Yeah, I mean, here it's not. It seems like he's not really getting much wrong. He mentions Dave Hilton leading the league, which is something he mentioned in that Dave Hilton piece too. That he won basically part of the batting championship that year.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, it's interesting that this time the the way that he refers to the epiphany, the God's grace, whatever you want to
Mm.
call it, is a revelation, and it is something out of the blue.
Hmm.
So we're getting a little bit. I mean, Revelation still has hints of kind of
Yeah.
religiosity to it, but we're kind of getting a little bit more abstract in what that was.
Yeah, I mean that religious aspect is not something I had really thought about until kind of hearing you point it out and thinking about some of the novels which you had mentioned where he mentions religion,
Mm.
such as which ones I think did you come to mind?
Yeah, well, for example, there's a kind of a passage in Wild Sheep Chase that kind of readers might remember. He takes a taxi ride, and the taxi driver is talking about how he's Christian and how he talks to God on the telephone at
Mm.
night.
Yeah, and then there's 1Q84 has that kind of shadowy religious organization. Also, I think Aomame's father is a missionary of some kind, right? Is that um,
That yeah, there's I that's that my novel's been a while for
yeah,
me, but yeah, I mean, and religion in various forms pops up. I mean, in nonfiction, for example, he did that whole book on Om Shinrikyo.
yeah,
So he's obviously got a kind of an interest in kind of cults and religion and belief and things like
and
that.
some kind of like hidden system that's organizing things in an invisible kind of
Mm,
way. And
mm, mm,
um,
mm. Now, whether he, believes in that or whether that he just thinks that's great fiction
yeah,
is something we don't know for sure.
yeah.
But yeah.
Okay, so then the next one is from the Mainichi Shimbun. I just read this one last summer. I went to the National Diet Library and pulled this one up. It's from October 12th, 2001. So this is like about another 10 years have passed. So it's been 20 years, over 20 years since the incident. And he says, I've written about this before, but the outfield seats at Jingu Stadium are where I suddenly realized I wanted to write a novel. It was opening day 23 years ago. I think Yasuda Takeshi was starting. On October 4th that year, the Swallow won the championship. Matsuoka Hiromu was starting and pitched a complete game. I was in the stadium that day as well. It was the first championship for the Swallows 29 years after being founded, and I happened to be 29 years old. I won the New Authors Prize for the novel I wrote that year. 23 years later, so this year, I was in the outfield seats at Jingu on October 4th again, watching Yakult against Hanshin. If they won the game, they would have won the series, but they lost. Even though they lost, I wasn't all that mad. In life, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. Sometimes things go well, sometimes they don't. There wasn't anything I could do, I realized. Maybe happy to see Inaba Atsunori sprint at full speed out to his spot like a shrewd black cat. Not a Black Panther. Roberto Pedagine spin the bat behind his head, and Takatsu Shingo flare his nostrils widely on the mound, which you could even see from the outfield. That's what baseball's all about. It's not just about winning and losing. That's something else I learned at Jingu Stadium. And here the outfield seats is Gayaseki.
Yes. And so, sorry, you I think said two different people started the game.
Oh, so there were two different games. The opening day game, Yasuda started, and then they won when they won the championship on October 4th.
Oh,
Matsuoka
right.
was starting. Yeah, that would be probably either my reading or the translation. Yeah.
No, that makes total sense. Yeah.
But yeah, he's got Yasuda right again. So if depending on Gayaseki, he's dropped off the there were no seats. That hasn't come up.
Yeah, and this might be a case of he's writing for the newspaper, right? So they give him a word count or a character count, and he decides that that's not an important step. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like this because it's a very simple kind of outline of the origin story, but then he goes on to talk about Yakult in 2001, and it kind of shows that he, as kind of famous as he got and whatever, he still remained a Swallows fan, which I just think is cool.
Mm-hmm.
He mentions Takatsu Shingo, who was a closing pitcher, who is now the manager of the team. So that's cool.
Oh, no way.
Well.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah.
So the next one we have is from October 15th, 2007. It's from his nonfiction book, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. It's been translated into English, I think, a few years after this, but it was published in Japan in 2007. And here's what he has to say. I can pinpoint the exact moment when I first thought I could write a novel. It was around 1:30 in the afternoon of April 1st, 1978. I was at Jingu Stadium that day, alone in the outfield, drinking beer and watching the game. Jingu Stadium was within walking distance of my apartment at the time, and I was a fairly big Yakult Swallows fan. It was a perfectly beautiful spring day, not a cloud in the sky, with a warm breeze blowing. There weren't any benches in the outfield seating back then, just a grassy slope. I was lying on the grass, sipping cold beer, gazing up occasionally at the sky, and leisurely enjoying the game. As usual for the Swallows, the stadium wasn't very crowded. It was the season opener, and they were taking on the Hiroshima Carp. Remember that Yasuda was pitching for the Swallows. He was a short, stocky sort of pitcher with a wicked curve. He easily retired the side in the top of the first inning, and in the bottom of the inning, the leadoff batter for the Swallows was Dave Hilton, a young American player new to the team. Hilton got a hit down the left field line. The crack of the bat meeting the ball on the right on the sweet spot echoed through the stadium. Hilton easily rounded first and pulled up to second. And it was at that exact moment that a thought struck me. You know what? I could try writing a novel. I still remember the wide open sky, the feel of the new grass, the satisfying crack of the bat. Something flew down from the sky at that instant, and whatever it was, I accepted it. I never had any ambitions to be a novelist. I just had this strong desire to write a novel. No concrete image of what I wanted to write about, just a conviction that if I wrote it now, I could come up with something that I'd find convincing. When I thought about sitting down at my desk at home, setting out to write, I realized I didn't even own a decent fountain pen. So I went to the Kinokuniya store in Shinjuku and bought a sheaf of manuscript paper and a $5 Sailor fountain pen, a small investment on my part. This was the spring of 1978, and by fall I'd finished a 200-page work handwritten on Japanese manuscript paper. Oh, and I should note that that's the official translation. I think Philip Gabriel did that, and then the the Sheepman lecture would have been either Jay Rubin's translation or Murakami's own writing. The other ones are kind of my makeshift translations.
So a few interesting things here. The date is the same. The place is the same. Again, we've got lying on the grass, and he even says, I still remember the smell of the new grass, which didn't exist. Sorry, guy. Um, if you look at photos of those bleachers at the time, they are pretty darn concretey. Not a lot of grass going on there. Um, and then the fountain pen as
Mm-hmm.
well becomes a $5 pen here.
Mm.
We would have to maybe look at the original Japanese to see
Yeah.
what the cost was. But if you're translating $5 in 2007, I'm gonna say this is probably 500 yen or
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
maybe a
If
thousand
the
at the
yeah with the
max.
exchange rate. Yeah.
Yeah. So he does say he doesn't own a decent fountain pen, so he goes to buy a decent fountain
Okay.
pen. So he's not dissing his
Yeah.
pen. He's not calling it cheap like he did. Um, but yeah, Dave Hilton doubles down the left field
Yep.
line. I think the placement of where exactly the ball flew
Yep.
kind of varies from story to story
Yep.
here. Um, we're being kind of nitpicky, but again, we've got some differences. You know, the other thing I noticed, I'm realizing now is this because this book was translated into English might be the first time
Mm.
that readers outside of Japan are getting their eyes on this origin story.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's probably right since the lecture was probably not terribly widely attended.
Right. And you know, for me personally, when I moved to Tokyo, I was really interested in watching Japanese baseball. I'd heard all these great things about it. Tokyo is one of the few cities in the world that has two professional baseball teams, right? You've got, you know, Chicago, New
Mm.
York, um, Seoul, I believe, has two or three, and Tokyo. So I knew that there was the Giants and the Swallows, and I went to check out both, and I instantly became a Swallows fan. And I think somewhere, I didn't think this consciously, but I'm sure somewhere in the back of my mind was this author I really like. This is his favorite team.
Hmm.
So I think this probably implanted in quite a few people the idea that, hey, in Japan, there's a baseball team with a kind of a funny name, and this cool author likes them.
Yeah. What was their
Yeah.
original name? Do you? I think I just learned it recently.
So they've gone through a few names, but their very first name was the
Oh, it
Swallows.
was.
Yes, but they were owned by Kokutetsu, which is the National Railway, which is now JR.
Oh.
Um, yeah, they were kind of established to give the Kokutetsu employees kind of morale, to kind of somebody to cheer for. But yes, at some point they got sold to Sankei, which is a publisher. Do the Sankei Shimbun, and at that time, this was when Tetsuwan
Mm.
Atamu, which in the states is known as Astro Boy, the Osamu Tezuka
Hmm.
manga, was really popular. The team wasn't popular at all, and so as a kind of a way to get more young people into the stands, they renamed it the Sankei Atoms, the Atoms,
Nice.
for a while, and then when it got sold to Yakult, it was Yakult Atoms for a year or two, and then they went back to Swallows.
Nice. I didn't know that
Yeah,
they were the Atoms. I knew that they were the Atoms, but I didn't know it was because of the Astro Boy. That's great.
yeah. In fact, it was like kind of an official tie-up. So the for a couple of years, the uniforms had a little Atom Kun or whatever his name is on them. So yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, the few years ago they did kind of a retro. You know, sometimes when teams kind of bust out their retro uniforms and fans can buy like replicas of the old uniforms, and those ones sold out pretty quick, just as kind of a funny, um, something different to have, you know.
Nice.
Yeah.
So I guess getting a little bit back to the account, he mentioned something flew down from the sky. So it's not, it's kind of moved away from revelation or epiphany or God's grace, but there's something, it's like this invisible something that
Mm.
is kind of otherworldly still a little bit, which is interesting. So, um, and then I think you also mentioned in the writing you did about it, about the crowd he mentions here that it wasn't very crowded. Is that true?
So I think again, as he's doing with the grassy slope, he's kind of mixing up a few Swallows games that he's been to over the years, which I don't blame him. I've been to quite a few games, and you're just sipping on some
Yeah.
beer, things get mixed up. But this particular game, I looked up the stats for it, and it was over 40,000 people at the game. At the time, Jingu could hold about 50,000. So a pretty full house. And it was opening day. So it's going to be pretty crowded, even if there aren't a ton of fans of the home team. Yeah. But on a typical day, once the season gets started, the crowds were pretty sparse at Jingu Stadium.
Yeah. Especially for a 1:30 game.
Yeah, right. And again, the Swallows were famously bad, and again, this is the year that they won the championship, and they ended up being decent that year. But they were bad before this, and they were bad for a good decade and a half after this as well. So, yeah.
The next essay or next account, actually, this is one that I found out about from you, the 2013 Swallows Crew essay. Do you want to read this one?
Sure. So this was the Swallows Crew is a kind of a fan club for the team. You can join the crew, and then you can buy kind of discount tickets and things like that. So in 2013 they kind of made Murakami an honorary member, and he wrote this little essay. It's longer than this, but this is an excerpt from it. It says, in 1978, the year the team won the pennant for the first time, I lived in Sendagaya, which made it easy to walk to Jingu, so I was almost always at the stadium. In those days, you could get into the outfield stands for free after 8:30, for which I was very thankful. That year, the Swallows organization turned 29 and won their first pennant, and went on to win the Japan Series. Well, I myself turned 29 and wrote my first novel. Ever since writing that first novel, Hear the Wind Sing, I've been a professional novelist. It's just a coincidence, of course, but I can't help thinking there's a thread of a connection. So again, we've got the 29 being an important number for him. A detail that we hadn't heard in those other stories, perhaps because it's less about his origin and more about the team. But the fact that you could get in to the outfield seats for free after 8:30 is pretty cool.
Yeah.
And as we know, he was kind of a not particularly well off kind of jazz cafe owner at the time. So I suspect there were some times when he would just kind of wait until 8:30 and then get in there.
Yeah, this is a cool find. Awesome little account. And then it's the next one we have is the last one. Or is it? We'll see. It's the last one, at least for this version of the origin story. It's from 2015. It looks like it's been used twice, I think. So you cite it from his book Novelist as a Vocation, which I think was later translated, right, and then into English. It also seems to be, or at least very similar to sections of the introduction to Wind Pinball, or Hear the Wind Sing, and Pinball 1973, the kind of collected edition that was published that year. And so let's see, I'll read this one. One bright April afternoon in 1978, I attended a baseball game at Jingu Stadium, not far from where I lived and worked. It was a Central League season opener, first pitch at 1 o'clock, the Occult Swallows against the Hiroshima Carp. I was already a Swallows fan in those days, so I sometimes popped in to catch a game, a substitute, as it were, for taking a walk. Season opener it may have been, but only a few fans were sitting beyond the outfield fence. I stretched out with a beer to watch the game. At the time, there were no bleacher seats there, just a grassy slope. The sky was sparkling blue, the draft beer as cold as could be, and the ball strikingly white against a green field, the first green I had seen in a long while. In the bottom of the first inning, Hilton slammed Sotokoba's first pitch into the left field for a clean double. The satisfying crack when the bat met the ball resounded throughout Jingu Stadium. Scattered applause rose around me. In that instant, for no reason and based on no grounds whatsoever, it suddenly struck me. I think I can write a novel. I can still recall the exact sensation. It felt as if something had come fluttering down from the sky and I had caught it cleanly in my hands. I had no idea why it chanced to fall into my grasp. I didn't know then, and I don't know now. Whatever the reason it had taken place, it was like a revelation, or maybe the English epiphany is a better word. Translated to Japanese, it means the sudden appearance of reality, intuitive grasp of truth, those kind of difficult words. All I can say is that my life was drastically and permanently altered in that instant when Dave Hilton belted that beautiful ringing double at Jingu Stadium. After the game, Yakult won, as I recall. I took the train to Shinjuku and bought a sheaf of writing paper and a fountain pen, Sailor, 2,000 yen. Word processors and computers weren't around back then, which meant we had to write everything by hand, one character at a time. The sensation of writing felt very fresh. I remember how thrilled I was. It had been such a long time since I had put fountain pen to paper. Each night after that, when I got home late from work, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote. Those few hours before dawn were practically the only time I had free. Over the 6 or so months that followed, I wrote Hear the Wind Sing. I wrapped up the first draft right around the time the baseball season ended. Incidentally, that year the Yakult Swallows bucked the odds and almost everyone's predictions to win the Central League pennant, then went on to defeat the Pacific League champions, the pitching-rich Hankyu Braves in the Japan series. It was truly a miraculous season that sent the hearts of all Yakult fans soaring. So this was probably one of the really widely read ones, right? I wonder, as an introduction to his novels published for the first time, how those did. I assume pretty decently.
Yeah, I would assume so too. Those novels are fascinating. Did you ever pick up the old translations of those?
Yeah, I've read both the old translations. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've read them though. Yeah.
Yeah, for people who don't know, these were his first two novels were translated into English by Alfred Birnbaum, right?
Yes.
But they were only released in Japan as kind of a kind of way to learn English.
It was part of Kodansha International's a series of books that include greats like The Great Gatsby, and in the back they have little vocab hints that so you can kind of compare it to learn little phrases in English in Japanese. So you can look up difficult words. So, but they were very hard to get for a long time.
They were, and they're the same size as the bunko. They're the bunkobon size, so you can put your English one and your Japanese one side by side, which I have on my shelf. Nice. But then later, many years later, 2015, these were officially released with a new translation.
Yeah,
right?
The official translation by Ted Goosen, I want to say.
Ted Goosen, right? Yeah. So, I mean, since this is a How to Japanese podcast, I'll just, as an aside, one of the most interesting things that I have ever done as a budding translator was to grab 3 copies of Hear the Wind Sing. One was the original Japanese, one is the Birnbaum translation, one is the Goosen translation. Open them up to, roughly the same page, the same text anyway, and just pour my eyes over kind of the original and then the 2 translations and just see how translation works in a way.
That's a great way.
I found that a very kind of fascinating, kind of a not quite a translation textbook, but in a way kind of even better.
Yeah, no, I've done that exact same reading, and I got stuck somewhere in the middle of Pinball 1973, which I think I'll probably talk about in a later episode why that might have happened. But those are both very interesting novels for sure, and that's a great one to look at.
They're good to read too, as kind of when you're getting into Japanese, I think, because they're short, and there's nothing more intimidating than sitting down with a 500-page book. Whereas those, I think, are 150 pages or something in the bunkobon. So you can sit down and go, yeah, I can get through this. Yeah.
But getting back to the intro, Murakami's doubled down on The Grassy Slope.
He sure has. He's had many chances to correct this, but he really, it's really in his brain that way.
And then he left Sotokoba in here too, even after fixing that in 2011. So maybe he forgot that he had fixed it.
Interesting.
And then the fountain pen has become 2,000 yen. Hilton hits it into left. But it's still opening day. It still swallows carp. The gist of the story is basically the same. And then how it ends up is also the same. So, but it's interesting. Yeah, I do think, as you mentioned with the crew essay, the target audience is very different here. So there's a lot more explanatory work needed to get English readership up to speed on what's happening in that season and things like that. So,
right.
But yeah, that's where it was. That is the Murakami origin story. And so, I mean, then last year, I was on Instagram, and David Marks, the author of Ametora, a history of traditional menswear in Japan, and also more recently a status and culture book on how culture works. He shared an Instagram post. I don't remember I'll have to share the link to that specific post in the show notes, but basically it was photographs from a 1980s magazine, a fashion magazine, a style magazine, and it happened to include an interview with Murakami. So the magazine is from June 1981. The magazine's called Checkmate, and the title of this interview is called "It's Difficult to Balance Both Writing and Running a Jazz Cafe, but That's What I Chose." And so this is actually an interview. This isn't a taidan. This is the writer has gone to interview Murakami. There's a picture of him taking a drag off a cigarette. So he's still smoking at this point. He hasn't quit. He's about to quit smoking at that point when he was, I think, writing A Wild Sheep Chase. The reason why I didn't know about this is because I had been using for years this one website that was written by this guy Osakabe Yoshio, who's written a list of Murakami's complete works, basically all of his magazine articles and taidan and everything. And so because this isn't quite an interview or quite a taidan, I guess it wasn't on his list. And so here is what the article says. And I should preface this by saying it's an interview, but it's also like it's very kind of squished together. The style of writing is very different. It's a very short piece. This is just an excerpt from it, so it's not like what you would typically expect from an interview, but it's an interview style, and it's expressing, I think, what this writer perceived from Murakami and what Murakami said. And it's difficult to tell which is which sometimes. And so here's that little section. What was your most immediate motivation for writing a novel? Well, it was basically that I thought I might be able to write one. I was watching baseball on TV. It was a pleasant, sunny April day. I was 29 years old. I wanted to do something before I turned 30. I got married as a student when I was 21. For the 7 years I was studying at Waseda, when I thought about getting a job, it felt like I'd have to hate my wife to not find some kind of work. I loved jazz, and I had a ton of records, so I felt like I might be able to run a jazz cafe, which is why I started one. I really worked to save up money. He responds so nonchalantly, I thought I might be able to write a novel, run a jazz cafe. As the interviewer, I wanted to draw out a little more of him, but when I've been interviewed myself in the past, I gave similar responses. I was finally able to see that he embodied the desire to live without a care in the world.
Daniel, did you just say he was watching baseball on TV?
Yeah, it blew me away. Like when when David shared this on Instagram, I immediately like put my fingers on the screen and like spread them out so I could zoom in, and I swore that's what I could read. But I went to the National Diet Library and printed out a copy of this to make sure that's what I saw, because for 40 years he's been saying that he was at the game, and here's this interview from 1981, a year after the first accounts that we went through earlier, saying that he watched it on TV. But I don't know. It kind of like threw me.
Well, you have a theory on
Yeah,
this,
I
right?
mean, my sense is that it's not a reliable interview. I feel like
Mm,
it's not. It's clearly not a transcript of what he said.
mm,
It's the writer is clearly jumping between a direct quote and then paraphrasing and then his own thoughts.
mm,
And so maybe he misheard, but I mean, at the same time, I think what's clear from the everything that we've looked at is that really what's most important is Murakami kind of giving himself permission to write from this story. I feel like.
mm. Absolutely, absolutely. I think something that leads credence to that as well is right after he says, "I watched it on TV." He says, "It was a pleasant, sunny April day," and it's like, well, if you're sitting inside watching on TV, then who cares if it's pleasant and sunny, you
No,
know?
absolutely. That's a good
So
point.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, going back to the larger point that you just mentioned, we're not really doing this podcast to kind of call out
No.
Murakami
Yeah.
for, oh no, hey, you said there was
Yeah.
grass, but there wasn't
Yeah.
grass. Yeah. It is funny and fun to catch those little inconsistencies. But I think, yeah, like you said, the larger issue is that uh, and as we've mentioned, most of these details are incredibly consistent over these various accounts. um, this kind of this idea that one day he was suddenly inspired to write and it had something to do with this baseball game is unequivocal.
Hmm. Yeah, and
um,
Dave Hilton in particular, and that the fact that he ran into Dave Hilton at a supermarket in Hilo just seems like icing on the cake. To be honest, like
that must have been kind of a uh, what's kind of one of those hero
yeah,
moments.
he got
um,
his autograph, and you can tell from the autograph. He even mentions this in the article that it's like, his kind of like handwriting isn't so neat, probably because he's got his kid on his shoulders. He's walking with his wife
mm,
with a bag full of groceries, and now he's signing an autograph for this soon to be uber famous Japanese writer. And he includes the signature in that miscellany that in the with that article.
oh, that's awesome.
So, yeah, no, I mean it's maybe it's not as surprising as I initially thought that a fiction writer wouldn't get nonfiction right,
Yeah,
but
that's right. And you know what? It's entirely possible that he is well aware that that season they had replaced the grassy slope with concrete stands, and he said to himself, "You know what? It's a way better story if it's a grassy slope."
yeah, I think it has to be for sure. I think that's part of the calculation, and I should be punished for calling him a fiction writer because, I mean, I think one of my goals with this podcast series will be to show that he is absolutely a translator. He is absolutely a nonfiction writer. He's absolutely an almost an agony aunt. You know, he's done so many, uh, answered so many questions. He's thousands and thousands of letters
Mm,
and emails from readers in Japan. Um,
yeah,
so yeah, but yeah, definitely interesting to look at as a whole and see how he's kind of characterized himself and that kind of creation story.
absolutely. I mean, the other fun thing for me as a fan of the Swallows is again like how kind of tightly he's connected himself with the team over the years. Aside from this particular story, which is obviously a huge part of his life, he's written kind of poems about the
Mm,
Swallows. His kind of recent essay book, First Person Singular, can't remember the Japanese
yeah,
title. Um, he has this kind of quasi fictional account of going to Swallows games and things like that. Obviously, he was happy to become a honorary, uh, big boss of the Swallows fan crew. Um, recently Murakami has traditionally been a very kind of closed guy, not given a lot of interviews and things like that. I don't know about you, but I found in the last few years he's been way more open
hmm
to the press. Um, I keep seeing his photograph on the cover of magazines.
yeah. He's got his
And
DJ Murakami radio that he's doing.
That's right. Yeah. So along with that, with him opening up his life to the public a little bit more, there was a photograph. And in fact, I think if you go to the Murakami library or whatever at Waseda, they've got a replica of his workspace, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And I believe there's a kind of a Yamada Tetsuto who's a Swallows player. He's got like a bobblehead on his desk, or at least he did at one point.
Nice.
So yeah, so I kind of like that. That in fact, the Murakami no Tokoro thing. Somebody asked him, "Hey, do you still go to games?" And he said, "Yes. If you see me in the stands, don't say hi.
That's hilarious.
Leave me alone."
That's great.
But yeah, I just really like the fact that he's kind of still a fan. And the last couple of years, there's been a young player that joined the team who's been great and hit 56 home runs last year, which is almost a record. A record for a Japanese player. Yeah. And his last name is Murakami.
Yeah, has he written anything about that? I feel like there's got to be something out there about that, right?
There's got to be something, yeah. But I just like the coincidence.
Yeah. Speaking of Jingu, I know that there's been some threats to some of the trees there. Is the stadium too up for?
Yeah, well, yeah. Unfortunately, not just the trees, but the plan that the Tokyo government has proposed and apparently has been at this point basically approved is to tear down the entire stadium and build a new one. So yeah, it's a shame. There's been a big movement to try to stop it, but once these kind of things get started, and the politicians and their construction company people get together and decide to build something, then it generally happens. But yeah, the stadium was built in I think it's 1926. Wow. So depending on how long they take to do this, it might hit 100 years old. And it's it's full of history. It's not just the Swallows. It's built on the extended Meiji Jingu Shrine property, and so it's technically a part of the shrine. So it has kind of been a holy place for baseball over the years. It was originally meant for amateur baseball for high school and college, and the college teams and high school teams still play there. So it's also one of the only baseball stadiums still standing where Babe Ruth played.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, there was a kind of goodwill. What do you call it? A bunch of American baseball players came over to Japan in the 30s as on a goodwill tour to kind of ease tensions. It didn't work, but it was Babe Ruth and a bunch of kind of other legendary players teaming up and playing a bunch of Japanese teams. And two of the stadiums that they played in, one is Jingu and the other one is Koshien down in Hyogo, where the Tigers play. And there would be no thought of tearing down Koshien because of its legendary status down there, and they host the yearly high school championship in the summer. So it's kind of it's not kind of a bummer. I'm hugely bummed out about them potentially tearing down Jingu. Well, I know there's a change.org petition, so you can go and sign that, and hopefully they'll kind of rethink that dumb idea.
Yeah, I was going to mention, actually, Rochelle Kopp, I think, has been one of the very vocal people behind that movement, and her Twitter is Japan Intercult. So if you check out her Twitter page, you'll be able to find that change.org.
She's great. And another one of the drivers behind that effort is Robert Whiting, who has written a bunch of books on Japanese baseball. Most famously, You Gotta Have Wa.
Yeah. And I can see on her Twitter feed that they are currently suing the Tokyo Metropolitan Government over Jingu Gaian. So they're asking for an injunction. So we'll see. To be continued.
To be continued. But, it would they would be smart to, and maybe they have reached out to Murakami himself, because he might be the world's most famous Swallows fan.
Yeah. No, I'll have to touch base with her. Maybe that's come to them. Maybe it hasn't. So where can people find you online? And do you have any new writing coming out soon?
So the kind of Matchley portal is matchley.com. You can it's SCHLEY, or just look at the name of the episode. And then I'm on all the usual stuff, Twitter, though it's slowly falling apart, and Instagram and all that good stuff. So yeah. And then yes, I do have some writing coming out. Funny that you ask. Yeah, there's a book I just translated called "Why I Make Documentaries," named by a awesome documentary filmmaker from Japan named Kazuhiro Soda. He makes these really interesting docs, and the book is all about his filmmaking philosophy and the experience he had while making a movie about 10 years ago. So the book was written in Japanese. It came out about a decade ago, and it's coming out this year, the English version, in about a month or so, so April or May 2023.
That's awesome. And is there one documentary that readers might want to read before they or see before they read your book?
Yeah, totally. It's a movie he made called Peace about a decade ago.
Okay.
Yeah, really fascinating. I don't want to spoil it, but he has a really interesting philosophy where he kind of eschews music or narration or kind of explanatory subtitles or things like that in favor of kind of letting the audience form their own interpretations of what's going on screen. So the book is kind of about how he came to that style and things like that.
Very cool. Is that like easily accessible in Japan or outside of Japan?
I believe actually you can rent it off of his official website.
Oh, nice. Okay.
I think it's kazuhirosoda.com or something like that.
Okay, perfect. So that sounds super easily to access. Although I guess it's not quite as easy as Netflix, but as long as it's online and accessible, that's great.
Yeah, not quite as easy as Netflix, but I think he owns all the rights to his films. So if you rent or buy it, you would be supporting him directly, which is
even better.
Cool. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.